Chapter 26 of Stories Part 3. With a crackle of magic and a flurry of disturbed snow, Twilight, Rainbow, Applejack, and star trails burst into being. The sun was setting, painting the smooth crystal of the wide balcony in marbled reds and yellows. Both of the strange crystal pony airships were moored to this tower, the south face, as Twilight remembered they called it, the same tower where the Argo had first made its landing. Although the interior was sealed behind thick doors of engraved crystal, Twilight could see the bustle inside with her pings. It was time for the feast, and ponies from all three towers had come to the south face to celebrate her arrival, and more importantly, her coming descent. Twilight glanced back at her friends. The malaise that had struck Rainbow when Twilight had given her the eye had retreated somewhat, probably pushed back by the imminent opportunity to preen while the crystal ponies fawned over her. Twilight was pleased her friend didn't seem stuck in a rut, but she was also still upset and confused that the gift she had put so much thought into had apparently done more harm than good. Applejack appeared more uneased than anything. She offered a tentative smile as she caught Twilight's gaze, one hoof reaching up to fuss at her hat, and Twilight smiled back. Although she couldn't help but be hurt by her friend's obvious struggle to accept what Twilight had become during their time apart, it was clear that she was trying, and Twilight was more than willing to give her space to adjust. She'd been a little surprised when Star Trails had asked last minute to attend the feast, rushing into the cargo hold just as Twilight was instructing Skill on how to behave during her absence. Sea Saber had made it plain that she did not trust the crystal ponies and wanted to keep her crew safe aboard the Argo, but it seems Star Trails had convinced her otherwise. Now the younger unicorn was beaming up at the tower before them, her green eyes glittering almost as much as the crystal. Twilight wondered how she'd react if she saw Midnight lounging on her back, sneering at the display of wonderment.
So this feast is all in your honor?
Trails asked as the group started for the doors.
Is it like a religious thing? I think so,
Twilight said.
I haven't had time to sit and talk with any of the crystal ponies about their culture, but they worship a being, or maybe a historical figure, I'm not sure, who they call the Shaper. And being...
She paused to choose an appropriate word.
Weirded? Like me, is a blessing from the Shaper.
She shrugged as they reached the door, placing a hoof against the warm crystal.
This ceremony is to send me off.
Trails cocked her head.
Are you going somewhere?
Twilight nodded.
Down into the central spire. I can sense something in there. And whatever it is, I think it'll be the key to figuring out what happened while I was gone. And maybe even how to fix it. Wow.
Trails shook her head, then looked at Twilight with an appreciative smile.
I'm glad I got to be here. Hey, what's the holdup?
Rainbow shoved between them, placing both hooves against the door.
Come on, we got a feast waiting.
She grunted as she pushed the heavy door open, and Twilight was immediately struck by the mouth-watering scent of cooking meat. The warm hall of the south face was packed with ponies, each one shimmering with the warm light radiating from the column of crystal piping in the center of the expansive chamber. All the bodies combined with the room's normal warmth left the air stuffy and hot, and so the crystal ponies had abandoned their furs, leaving their bodies bare but for their twinkling bone and crystal jewelry. Some of the tents had been torn down and pushed up against the walls, the huge cauldrons normally kept inside left exposed for ponies to gather around and share each other's company. The eldest ponies were mostly seated around the circular table that filled the center of the room, chatting among themselves or entertaining the foals with fondly told stories. The festivities didn't slow as Twilight and her friends filed inside, but it didn't take long for someone to notice and call out their arrival. Chosen! A scarred, pale gray stallion approached them with a wide, sharp-toothed smile, a trio of similarly rugged ponies behind them. And Dash! He turned his grin on Rainbow, greeting her with a hard smack to her back that made the Pegasus wince. With your arrival, now the feast can truly begin. A roar of approval went up from several of the ponies within earshot, sending Twilight's ears flat against her head. Rainbow wrapped one leg around the stallion, looking to her friends with a smug smile.
Twi, AJ, Trails, this is Bo. He's the captain of the Crystal Heart. I met him on the hunt.
Yes! Bo laughed and gave Rainbow a one-legged shake. She is Yak Slayer, and saved my dear Esmeralda's life. Your arrival has truly brought great fortune to our home, Chosen. He bowed, the ponies behind him following suit, and Twilight looked away with a quiet,
Thank you. This is all too much.
Midnight stood beside her, eyes alight with glee.
No, this is perfect. We should stay here and conquer this place after we explore the spire. These fools wouldn't even fight us.
In their mind's eye, Twilight affixed Midnight with a disapproving stare. In reality, meanwhile, she cleared her throat and tried to nudge Bo up off the ground.
This feast is really great, thank you. But, my friends don't eat meat.
She glanced back, catching Applejack's expression of poorly concealed disgust and Trails' nervous curiosity.
Is there anywhere they could get some vegetarian food? Or maybe a drink? And do you know where I can find Ametrine?
Of course! Bo straightened up at once, already pointing a hoof towards the tent near the entrance. The elders remembered the story of the last equestrian visit and picked fresh caps from our farm, and we have herbs picked from the nearby islands. As for drink, he offered an apologetic shrug. I'm afraid we have only blood soup and water, but they say equestrian water is of poor stock compared to our own. Rainbow scoffed.
I bet it is, dude. You want to go get some food, AJ?
I reckon it'd be the polite thing to do.
Applejack pursed her lips as Rainbow zipped towards the indicated tent. She glanced uncertainly to Twilight before following. Twilight turned back to Bo with an anxious smile.
Thank you, really. You didn't have to go through all this trouble.
It is our honor! Bo pounded a hoof against his chest. And you wish to speak to Ametrine? She's seated at the table with the other elders, preparing to tell the story of the world's first thawing. I'm sure she would like to welcome you herself.
Story time, huh?
Trails asked.
I want in on that.
Twilight dipped her head.
Thank you again, Bo. I hope you enjoy the feast.
He bowed again, and Twilight turned toward the center of the room, hoping to avoid the louder festivities in favor of talking to the elders, only to nearly smack into another group of crystal ponies. They each bowed just like Bo had, and Twilight grimaced as she realized they were waiting for her to bow back. She returned the bow quickly, hoping they'd be pleased and leave her be, but then they each approached her individually, shaking her hoof or hugging her or slapping her on the back as they introduced themselves and told her how happy they were that she was there. Twilight kept a stiff smile through it all, offering polite responses until they finally had their fill and walked away, chatting excitedly amongst themselves. And then there was another group waiting, and it suddenly clicked in Twilight's mind that she was the guest of honor, and just about every crystal pony in the hall wanted to talk to her.
Oh, Celestia, this is like all those Kennerlock garden parties I went to with the princess.
She shivered at the memories of being pulled away from her library and shoved in front of bickering petty nobles, given no time to herself to read or talk to the one or two interesting ponies that would show up each time.
I don't know if it's better or worse that they're all so sincere. I'll feel bad if I don't talk to them. Oh, how terrible.
Midnight straightened up when the third group approached.
Command them to step aside. They can shower us with adulation as we pass.
Twilight's smile grew strained as the stallion approached with a young foal balanced between his ears. It was difficult to maintain the expression with Midnight constantly trying to twist it into an imperious frown.
Would you stop that? These ponies are only trying to be nice to us. There is nothing nice about being stopped by 108 sycophants, little flower. They have their place behind or beside, but never in front.
A pony walked up with a wide wicker tray on her back, filled with cuts of spiced meat that made Twilight's belly rumble.
On the other half, perhaps we should indulge them for a moment.
Every time Twilight finished speaking to one group and tried to make a step towards the table, another would appear, just as eager and friendly as the last. Some of them brought her gifts, either samples of meat cooked with their most beloved family recipes or small pieces of jewelry made in the local fashion. And before long, Twilight was forced to get Trails a tray to carry the excess food on, assuring the crestfallen gift givers that she would eat it after her descent into the spire and that, yes, she would tell the Shaper all about how delicious it was. Thankfully, she had no piercings, but that didn't stop a few crystal ponies from offering to give them to her. And even without earrings, she could feel the weight of her accumulated necklaces and mane beads pulling her down. The Star Trails, for her part, seemed to be having a blast. The crystal ponies were happy to talk to any friend of the Chosen, freely answering all of her questions, and even giving her some gifts too. It pained Twilight that she couldn't hear the answers to Trails' questions over the clamor, but she promised herself that she would have plenty of time to interrogate the other mare later. She didn't want to offend their hosts, and even if their attentions were exhausting, they really were just trying to be nice. There was one pony in the never-ending stream that stood out to her, though. She had noticed him standing alone near the Elder's table, a younger stallion with a sparkling blue coat that reminded her of the Ursa Minor she had dealt with in Ponyville. He stole nervous glances between her and the Elders, his gaze sometimes wandering around the room before jumping down to his hooves. He approached her alone, after most of the other crystal ponies had said their piece and the way to the Elder's table was clear. She took a deep breath, bracing herself for more fawning, and greeted him with a thin smile.
Chosen Twilight?
He bowed quickly, not waiting for Twilight to return the gesture before he rose.
My name's Azuric. It's an honor to meet you.
The honor's mine, really.
Twilight said, just like she had told the past dozen ponies. She paused, waiting for him to pull out some gift or continue to praise her, but he said nothing. He bit at his lip, looking at something behind her, but when she glanced back, all she saw was Star Trails nervously accepting a bowl of blood soup from a group of foals. Seconds passed, and Midnight's impatience picked at her hooves. She was just opening her mouth to bid him goodbye when he spoke again, squeezing his eyes shut, as if he were afraid of something.
You're to descend tonight?
Twilight arched a brow.
After the ceremony, yes.
He nodded, keeping his gaze down.
Are you scared?
Twilight frowned. Here she was, talking about trekking down into the dark, abandoned ruins of an impossible empire that was no doubt home to at least one horrific monster. And it hadn't even occurred to her until now whether she should be scared. After braving the pitch-dark carcass of Canterlot and traveling hundreds of miles across the ocean floor filled with corpses and beasts, the thought of exploring the Crystal Palace alone barely registered as something to fear. She knew to be cautious, yes, but she was more curious than frightened. She thought back to how she had felt the first time she'd stepped out of the Argo's submarine and drifted into the sodden ashes of Ponyville, clad in that metal coffin. Horrified, frightened, guilty. Had she lost something along the way?
I'm not.
She said.
Should I be?
No. As Zurich risked meeting her gaze, giving her a brief glimpse of his purple eyes. That's what the elders say, at least. He sighed, turning away and disappearing into the crowd without saying goodbye.
How very odd.
Midnight mused.
The others are all so much better at groveling. I feel like he was hiding something.
Twilight thought as she made for the elders' table.
He's trying to find an answer without asking the question. Perhaps we can ask after the question another time.
Midnight was sitting on the table in front of Ametrine, the regent's plate of half-eaten seared steak between her chipped hooves.
But for now, it is only a distraction.
Noticing Twilight out of the corner of her eye, Ametrine turned and stood to greet her fully with a warm smile. The thick hide she had been wearing when they last spoke were gone, revealing her soft pink coat and long, icy blue mane.
Chosen Twilight, I hope my ponies weren't too eager with their welcomes on your way here.
She glanced knowingly at the jewelry festooning Twilight's body. Twilight giggled.
I've been through worse. Is it okay if I ask you some questions about the descent?
Ametrine answered with a sagely nod.
I would love to answer any questions you have. However, now that you are here, it is my duty to call the feast together and tell the story of the first thaw. I hope you will allow me this honor. Oh, of course.
Twilight dipped her head. It wasn't exactly what she had had in mind, but it sounded like some kind of creation myth, and she could discern many clues from hearing it.
Should I sit, or... You may have my seat.
Ametrine gestured toward her spot in front of the table, between two quietly watching elders.
When the story is told, come see me. We may speak as we ascend the spire.
With a grateful bow, Ametrine took her leave. Twilight spent a few seconds watching as she circled the table and made for the stairs that led to the upper exit, ponies quietly parting to clear a path.
Twilight, did you hear that?
Trails came up to her side and clapped her hooves.
I've heard some great stories already, but this one sounds special.
Twilight smiled. She'd never seen her so enthusiastic before.
I suppose we should sit down. Have you seen Applejack and Rainbow Dash? They were hanging out with the hunters, I think. Oh, there they are.
Rainbow and Applejack stepped out of the crowd, the former wearing a smug grin, and the latter, although still clearly uneased, appearing more relaxed than before. Rainbow was holding a horn in one hoof, her lips stained a dark red.
Why?
She smiled, showing more red on her teeth.
Have you had this blood soup? It's not bad.
Ain't good either. Ugh.
Applejack mumbled.
Dang, I threw up and that mess hit my tongue.
I mean, yeah, me too.
Rainbow shrugged, taking a very tiny sip from her horn.
But, you get used to it, What's it taste like?
Trails asked.
Actually, you think I could try it? Are you tough enough?
Rainbow grinned as she held out the horn.
This horn is from the yak I killed, by the way. Pretty cool, huh?
Trails took the horn in both hooves and looked down into it pensively, muzzle scrunching up at the scent. Taking a deep breath, she closed her eyes and lifted it to her lips, and immediately dropped it as she slapped her hooves across her mouth, hunching over with bulged cheeks. Twilight grabbed the horn in her magic, doing her best to catch the spilled soup before it hit the floor. She rubbed at Trails' back with a hoof as the mare retched, using the distraction to sneak a sip of her own.
Delicious.
Midnight licked her lips.
We should take one of the crystal ponies to cook for us.
Rainbow doubled over laughing.
you should have seen the look on your face. Oh, that is priceless.
Applejack rolled her eyes.
Not like y'all weren't there all of 10 minutes ago or nothing.
Trails' tongue hung loose as she straightened up.
Yeah, I regret that. I think we could get Flint to try some.
A trio of deep, rhythmic bangs echoed throughout the room, drawing all eyes upward. Ametrine stood on the balcony, overlooking the chamber, leaning on a simple staff of gnarled wood. She looked over the room with a motherly smile as she waited for silence. Within a minute, every pony in attendance had taken a seat, with the elders at the center of the room where it was warmest, the foals in a thin circle around them, and the adults gathered in clumps around burning braziers or cauldrons. Ametrine cleared her throat before speaking in a steady, strong voice that carried clearly across the chamber.
You all know why we are here, I'm sure. Chosen Twilight has come to us from Equestria, honoring us with the presence of herself and her companions, and above all, promised to fulfill the Shaper's will by taking the descent into the spire to join his ranks and help defend the Crystal Empire from the darkness that lives beneath the ice. Many stories will be told of today's hunt, and I expect more will be made by the time the sun sets and our visitors from the East Face and West Face return to their homes with full bellies and smiling lips. But for now it is time for me to fulfill my duty, and for the second time in my service as regent, tell the story of the first thaw.
Midnight stepped up next to Ametrine with an exaggerated yawn.
How melodramatic. Quiet! I'm interested in this. 1,000 years ago, before the Shaper came to our world, all was darkness and cold, encased within a single unbroken shard of crystal. When the Shaper came, she saw this crystal and was inspired by its beauty. And so, gathering up chisel and hammer, he took the image in his mind and worked tirelessly through a single, endless night. And when he set his tools down, the Crystal Empire was born. The Shaper was pleased, but when the sun rose and melted the ice that encased the world, she was inspired again by its warmth. So he took up his tools once more, gathering the heat of the sun into 2 crystals he carved after his likeness, and mixing it with her love for what she had made. And when she set her tools down, the crystal ponies were born.
Twilight frowned.
I don't understand. She keeps using different pronouns for the Shaper.
Midnight hummed and thought.
What of the idol we saw at the top of the spire? 2 faces, each turned away from the other. Some kind of dual aspect of deity, then? Maybe.
Twilight nodded, keeping her eyes on Ametrine as she continued the story.
The crystal ponies were enamored by their creator and the city they had been given. But the sun was jealous. It whispered into each of the Shaper's ears and planted a seed of darkness in his heart, splitting his soul in 2. And the Crystal Empire was sundered by strife and bloodshed. Sister fought against brother and mother against son. And the sun smiled as the Shaper's creation was brought low. The fighting touched every heart in the Empire, spreading the seed of darkness planted by the sun until one day, the crystal ponies grew tired of warring. They came together and petitioned the Shaper for peace. And seeing that the violence was bringing nothing but pain to her creation, the Shaper sealed her souls away within the spire, vowing not to return until peace could be found. The crystal ponies rejoiced, but the sun heard of this from on high, and it flew down into the depths of the spire to confront the Shaper. The battle went on for 3 days and 3 nights, rocking the very foundations of the Empire with its violence, until, at last, the Shaper was able to defeat the sun, striking a mortal blow on its breast. But the sun was crafty and vicious, and as it fought, it hid its shadow away in the spire, and it fled high into the sky, far from the Shaper's reach, withdrawing its warmth from our land out of petty spite.
The sun,
Midnight mused.
this must be your darling Celestia.
But why would she be the villain in the Crystal Ponies mythos?
Twilight shook her head, pursing her lips in thought.
And if she's the villain, then maybe Cadence isn't the Shaper after all? What could possibly drive Celestia to that kind of violence?
Twilight's eyes shot wide open, mouth gaping as she looked back to Ametrine.
Unless the Shaper created the corruption.
Ametrine's voice grew somber and quiet. And looking around, Twilight saw many of the crystal ponies leaning in attentively, ears turned forward.
Although the Shaper had emerged victorious, the sun had committed a terrible crime. The heavens wept for the blood spilled between families, a torrent of rain never seen before or since that threatened to destroy everything the Shaper had built. She ran through the streets as the rains flooded the homes of our paradise, gathering us to her and bringing us all to safety high in the spire. And when the winds finally stopped, and the air grew cold and the ice froze beneath us, the Shaper taught us how to survive. He taught us to hunt, to create the tools we need from the bodies of our own predators, to fend off the cold with the burning of yak oil, and to gather the herbs and the spices that grow upon the islands. But she could not stay with us forever. The shadow left behind by the sun encroached ever higher, threatening to rise above the ice and swallow us all. And so the Shaper descended alone into the spire, promising that he would return when it was defeated to guide us into a new age of paradise. And when this battle grows hard and he requires our aid, he summons us with the signs of her blessing, selecting the chosen.
Ametrine raised her voice once more, turning to look at Twilight directly.
And now here we stand, another chosen in our number, feasting in celebration as we prepare for her descent. She will stand at the Shaper's side in the spire, granted the ceaseless vitality of one of his servants, and she will fight the darkness. And when at last it is defeated, she and every other chosen will return with the Shaper, and we will rejoice with a feast that will be remembered for 100 generations.
The crystal ponies cheered, their hooves stomping against the floor and filling the air with roiling thunder. Ametrine smiled down at them all as she leaned on her staff, waiting for the applause to abate.
With the first story told, it is time for others to follow. But first, I must take my leave.
Ametrine looked to Twilight again before bowing her head.
For it is time for chosen Twilight to make her descent and stand at the Shaper's side.
Twilight blinked, suddenly realizing that every eye in the room was turned on her. She stood up with a nervous giggle. The thought of braving the dangerous ruins of Equestria may not faze her, but being the center of attention like this was enough to make her hooves tremble. In the corner of her eye, she saw Midnight shaking her head in disapproval.
Right. Just give me a moment to say goodbye to my friends first.
Ametrine nodded, and Twilight let out the breath she had been holding as the crystal ponies looked away, the room filling with excited chatter once more. She turned to her friends with a relieved smile.
Wait, Twi.
Rainbow was watching her with a concerned frown.
You're coming back, right? She's making this sound like it's a one-way trip.
For the crystal ponies, I think it is.
Twilight said.
But don't worry, Rainbow. I have every intent of returning the moment I discover what's waiting down there. This ceremony, the titles, everything. I'm indulging their traditions to learn what I can before I set hoof into the spire.
She shrugged, glancing around and lowering her voice.
To be honest, I expect the Shaper is based on a real pony. Maybe even Cadence. She may have just told them this story so they wouldn't worry about her.
Ain't you worried that they might be a bit upset when you come back, though?
Applejack asked.
They built their traditions around this story, Twi. Don't tell them what they'll do if something endangers it.
I can always just teleport onto the Argo from under the ice if I have to.
Twilight said.
They would never know I came back. Hey, I have a question.
Trails raised a hoof.
Who's Cadence?
Twilight's old full sitter,
Rainbow said.
really likes the color pink.
And she's an alicorn.
Applejack added. Trails blinked. A couple seconds passed as she gasped.
There's 3 of them?
Twilight giggled. She stepped forward, pulling Applejack and Rainbow into a tight hug.
Thanks for everything, girls. You'll be the first to know when I get back.
We'd come with you if you asked, you know.
Rainbow said, returning the hug.
I know,
Twilight smiled as she stepped back.
and I appreciate it. But it's dangerous under the water. And I could never forgive myself if something happened to any of you.
She grimaced, bracing herself for an argument.
I feel like this is something I have to do myself.
To her surprise, Rainbow only nodded and looked away.
Yeah, I get it. We'll make sure Luna is safe and find out what we can up here.
Thank you.
Twilight's smile returned quickly.
Wish me luck. I'll be back before you know it.
With one last wave, Twilight turned and made for the stairs. The crystal ponies gave her a respectful berth as she walked, bowing their heads low in a way that made her gut clench. But she kept her head up high as she climbed the stairs and stopped at Ametrine's side.
Are you ready?
The old mare smiled, holding out a hoof as she turned for the door behind her. She had donned her cloak since finishing the story.
We will make the climb alone.
Twilight nodded, stepping closer so Ametrine could lean on her.
Let's go.
Night had fallen when they walked out onto the balcony and started across the bone bridge. An ethereal rainbow glow shone down on them from above, and Twilight looked up in wonderment as she spotted what looked to be a glowing river of light meandering across the night sky. The spire caught the light in its crystal, channeling it down into the ice and seeming to pulse with gentle blues and greens as they climbed the steps. Ametrine let out a quiet chuckle.
So many good omens. Never have I seen a pony as blessed as yourself, Twilight Sparkle.
Twilight looked down to her, patiently waiting for the elder mare to take each step before following.
Have you seen Minnie Chosen? I have been lucky enough to escort 2 others up the spire before you,
She said.
a young mare named Angeline and an older stallion, Agate Apricot. So it happens often?
Ametrine answered with a thoughtful hum.
Not often, no. Most regions see only 2 or 3 from their ponies. The most do not get visitors from Equestria. So perhaps the Shaper favors me as well.
She smirked, giving Twilight a playful wink. Twilight couldn't help but smile back, and the two continued the climb. Midnight draped herself over Twilight's back. Her presence felt as a tingling warmth against her coat. It was strange. This moment of quiet isolation with the Elder was exactly what Twilight had been hoping for when she arrived at the feast. An opportunity to question her about the details of what it meant to be chosen or to send the spire, but now that she had it, she found herself content to climb in silence. Even her best friends were still struggling with their doubts about her changes. But Ametrine felt so genuine and accepting. And Twilight was loath to violate the comfort of her quiet company. But as they approached the top, the questions began to nag at her once more. This would be her last chance to learn more before facing whatever awaited her inside the spire.
Ametrine,
She said.
I noticed that sometimes you refer to the Shaper as a he, and sometimes as a she. Why is that?
Ametrine smiled.
Let us finish the climb first. It will be easier to explain.
Twilight pursed her lips, but did not object. Finally, they crested the winding steps, and together they stepped through the fur curtain that warded the tower's peak from the worst of the cold. Although there was nobody else there, the braziers around the edges were still burning, filling the space with their warm light. Twilight's gaze was immediately drawn to the circle of black crystal that dominated the center of the room, and inside it, the 2-headed statue of the Shaper. Ametrine stepped away from Twilight, walking slowly towards one of the 3 hearts engraved on the floor and sitting down with a quiet grunt.
The Shaper is not a pony like you or I, Twilight.
She began, looking up at the statue.
She was split in 2 by the curse of the sun. And his 2 halves are often at odds, though they also often work together.
She pointed a hoof towards the slender feminine head, its brow crested with a long horn.
She is kind, caring, and wise.
Her hoof shifted towards the masculine head opposite, its horn curved and sharp.
And he is brave, protective, and fierce. Together, they are the Shaper, who saved us from the spite of the sun. But each pony will speak of her differently, depending on their relationship with her and, at times, the subject being discussed. The hunters most often relate to the Shaper's west face,
She continued, nodding towards the masculine head.
for that is how they know him best. Mothers, by contrast, know the Shaper by her east face. Do you understand?
Twilight nodded.
I think so. Good.
Ametrine smiled.
Now,
Are there any more questions you would like to ask this old mare?
A gust of wind blew past the tower, rippling the heavy hides that hung around them. Twilight looked to Midnight, spotting her dark passenger leering at the black crystal from the shaded edge of the room.
Can you tell me what's down there?
I cannot,
Ametrine said gently.
Only the chosen are permitted entrance, and they do not return. But this is the task given to us by the Shaper, and we owe her our very existence. He has always been there to protect us.
Twilight nodded, taking a deep breath.
Can you make the climb back down on your own?
Ametrine let out a quiet chuckle.
Do not worry about me, Twilight. I was a young mare once, but the ice makes us strong. I will be fine.
Okay.
Twilight stepped slowly up to the crystal, staring into its inky black surface. She reached a hoof out, feeling Midnight's presence coiled within. The crystal was cold and smooth under hoof. The tower shuddered, and a section of crystal slid down into the floor, revealing the top of a curving stairwell, the steps fading into darkness.
Are you ready? We are.
Together, Twilight and Midnight started down the stairs. The black crystal snapped shut behind them.